I'd like to say I appreciate your presence here this morning. Hopefully the things that I'm going to discuss this morning are things that will be helpful to you and I. I want you to know that this lesson that I'm about to give is one that I feel like I really need and something that was of interest to me. In my reading of the scriptures at night, I ran across a passage that I want to share with you today, that where most of my thoughts come from. But one of the things that I want to talk about is this lack of patience, and one of the things that I want to talk about is that last Sunday Brent talked about a lesson about how you and I ought to be concerned about the direction that our hearts are pointed in, or that our mindset is in, and that direction ought to be toward heaven, not on things on the earth. And as you read on down through those verses, in the 8th verse of Colossians, the 3rd chapter where that thought came from, it goes on to say, "But now you also put off all these: anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy communication out of your mouth." And and the verse that I want to think about is in Ecclesiastes, the 7th chapter, in the 8th through the 10th verse, where it reads there, says, "Better is the end of a thing than the beginning thereof, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Be not hasty in thy spirit to be angry, for anger resteth in the bosom of fools. Say not thou, what is the cause that the former days are better than these? For thou dost not inquire wisely concerning this." And as I thought of these things that are mentioned, and anger is certainly one of those things that we find mentioned there in the passage where we are. And when I think about these, that when he starts to talk about these, he talks about anger, he talks about wrath, he talks about malice, blasphemy, and then he talks about filthy communications out of your mouth. And as I made the connections, I wanted for us to think about that one of the root causes of these things is a lack of patience. And that's what I want to talk about this morning. I got to thinking that if some way I could work on something that would touch these areas, wouldn't it be a good thing for me? That when it came to, I think about anger and I go, yeah, I participate in that one. And then I think about wrath. Yeah, I'm probably caught up in that thing too. When I get to malice, I go, well, I don't have a whole lot of feelings where, I'm sitting around thinking, man, how can I hurt someone? Or how can I do something this or that to the hurt of another person? So I go, okay, I'm not that steeped in malice. Blasphemy, man, listen. When I first joined the church, that's one of the first things that I learned you don't want to participate in is blasphemy. Old Brother Irvin Shep used to always ask me, he said, what's the sin that you can't get forgiveness of? And he wanted me to talk about it. I was like, man, Irvin, I don't know what that is. But I found out pretty quick what it was. When you and I start to talk against the Son of God and we start to blaspheme God and things of that nature, boy, we're digging ourselves a hole that we may not ever recover from. But so I've left off blasphemy, for the most part, I suppose. Filthy communication out of my mouth. I think about that and I go, well, in my younger days, yeah, you could have probably caught me, But I got to say that one of the areas where I've made some progress in is in the area of filthy communication out of my mouth. I don't go around using cuss words anymore. That's not something I've taken it out of my language, out of my vocabulary, for the most part, and I'm glad I did that. But filthy communications out of our mouth is just not cuss words, because you and I can sit around and gossip and talk about others in a hurtful way. Hey, guess what? Filthy communications out of your mouth. We can sit down at work or in other places and talk about stories that are not very nice to talk about, that are really or evil or bad, and filthy communications out of our mouth. And so that little term at the end there, for the most part, we think, well, I've done away with cussing, but it incorporates more than that, and so it's a problem. And So one of the things that I read in Ecclesiastes, that I thought about in Ecclesiastes, and these are the areas that I want to cover, that the advice that the writer of Ecclesiastes gave us. And what he said was, number one, we're going to look at when he advises us to be not hasty, and about having a lack of patience in our spirit. The second thing that we find that I want to talk about is that he talked about be not rash with thy mouth. And so we'll talk a little bit about that this morning. And finally, that last verse that we read, he talks about when we go about and talk about, when we say, well, the former days, my former days, boy, for the good old days. I used to ride with some people. Well, I told you all about this before on several occasions, how we used to have that discussion. And one gentleman would begin, boy, for the good old days. And I remember a fellow by the name of Coy Akins was driving that day, and he was driving this new Chrysler Cordova that he got. And he said, boys, you can have your good old days. I'm content with what God has given me today. And it shocked me, and I haven't forgotten that to this day. You could tell that it impressed me that he would make that statement. And I wonder about this inquire wisely, and I want to talk about that for just a little while this morning. And so as we get into, I may not talk very long this morning, but I hope what I have to say will be of interest to you and will be something that you can use. The main thrust of this lesson, and I want to say this before I get into it, has to be the need we have for patience. The underlying root that we're going to find out to all these areas that we mentioned this morning, one of the underlying reasons, and perhaps one of the largest one, is the fact of a lack of patience on my part and on your part. And I got to thinking that if we could some way find things to do to strengthen, to build up our ability to be patient, that these areas would come right along with it, would disappear from being a problem for you and I. And so I want to talk about these kind of things. First of all, be not hasty. In Ecclesiastes, the 7th chapter and the 8th verse, he said, better is the end of a thing than the beginning thereof, and the patient in spirit better than the proud in spirit. Ask yourself the question, why would a writer write what this writer wrote? Better is the end of a thing than the beginning thereof. Well, some of the reasons that I thought about, sometimes we can, as we think about this, we can get where I need to be here. Go back one. A lot of times when I'm in a discussion with somebody and we start to talk about something, because I lack patience and because I'm hasty in spirit, and let's admit it, that's being proud is another thing that jumps in there. I'll cut them off, say, hey, I know all about that. I'm an expert in that area. Let me tell you about it, right? I never hear the end of the event, perhaps. I never listen to the details. What was the purpose of the conversation to begin with? What are we talking about? So the writer addresses that little problem. You see, you can't know the purpose of an event in total without listening to it, without being involved in it. Another thing is that if you and I are going to determine whether the conversation or the event that we're involved in is good or bad or of no consequences, if we jump right in at the front and make a determination, we have no idea which one of those categories it falls into. It could be good, it could be bad, it could be, hey, no consequences at all. And so, another thing that he says, or that it implies, is as better, God thinks it's better for you and I to eschew evil. But how are we going to do that if when, we consider, well, I heard the very first part of it and I made up my mind and I know what it is. Therefore, the writer says, you know something? That this particular statement is true. That better is the end of a thing. For then you and I are able to discern, to evaluate properly the event, the content of what we're involved in. But if you and I are hasty, as this scripture wants us to think about, if we're hasty in spirit, if we're proud and think we know all things, and that we don't need to listen to the rest of it, then there's a problem. And he said, it's better for you to quit being hasty. It's better for you to be humble than proud. And it's better for your patience if you'll behave this way. You know, God talks about people sometimes about their ability to eschew evil, to avoid evil things, and that it was one of the characteristics or the traits that they exhibited in their lives, that they had this desire or this ability to make a judgment and to decide whether it was good or evil, and to say, if it's evil, I'm staying away from it. God recommends that you and I do that. In Proverbs, the 16th chapter and the 25th verse, one problem that we got, though, is it says, there is a way that seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. And so, in our haste and in our being proud, as we jump to conclusions and reach the wrong decisions, maybe, a lot of times we feel like, I know what the answer is, but people aren't listening to me. So therefore, I'll talk a little louder. I'll get a little madder. I'll raise my voice, and I'll get my point across. But a lot of times we don't stop to evaluate that, the problem that the writer writes here about when you and I elect to be that way all the time and practice that way of life. There are a lot of things that are going to harm our spirituality and our soul, because it's not the right thing to do. It demonstrates a lack of having patience and being able to make good decisions. Another example that I thought about, you go to 2 Kings, the 5th chapter. I'm not going to take time to read that story, but it's the story of Naaman. You know it well. A captain in the Syrian army who contracted leprosy, and in those days leprosy was a very terrible thing. Most of the time it led to your demise, took away your life. But before that happened, it also made it so that you were also not sociably acceptable. As a matter of fact, one of the rules was that if you caught leprosy, you were supposed to, when you walked around, holler, unclean, unclean, so people would walk away from you and leave you alone. And so the social ramifications of that particular disease was a pretty horrible thing. Naaman finds out that there's a man of God who has the ability to cure him of his leprosy from a young lady, and he goes down to see Elisha. And Elisha tells him, hey, look, what you need to do is go down to the river Jordan, dip 7 times, and you'll be clean. Now, a person in a very important position like this man was, you would have thought that he would have had a lot of ability to weigh his options out and to make good decisions. But the Scripture said this about Naaman, that he went away in a rage. And what was his rage about? He said, man, I thought that this guy was going to come out and was going to wave his hand and do all these magical things to me, and my leprosy would be gone. Now, can you imagine throwing away your life because it didn't happen the way you thought it should have? Hey, there are a lot of things in my life that are not far from those kind of examples. With very little thought, perhaps, just like Naaman did. Now, thank goodness when you read the story, as another person comes and talks to him and says, hey, listen, man, think about this. You need to think about all the aspects of what's going on here. You need to think about your life and how, just go dip in the water 7 times and you're clean. And so he did it. But there's an example of how being hasty and being proud and having a lack of patience can be a difficult thing for you and I, can lead us to a place to where, it is the way of death that leads us to our downfall. I got carried away, didn't click my way. It's very important for you and I to check the level of patience you and I have. When I think about what Ecclesiastes says here about having a lack of patience, that it's not a good thing. It's something that you and I need to consider. But even more important, it ties things like anger, wrath, blasphemy, malice, filthy communications, those kind of things, with that dearth that we have of this characteristic called patience. And I thought, man, this is a thing that you and I need to have very much of patience. And yet, oftentimes, it's the very thing that I have a lack of and when I need it. And so I hope that we can appreciate when we catch ourselves being hasty or wanting to jump to a conclusion, not listening to all the facts that lead to a particular situation, to consider the evil that we can be involved with and the damage that we can do to our own lives and our own souls. Now, for the next thing that I want to talk about, I want to turn to Ecclesiastes, the 7th chapter and the 9th verse, where it went on to say, "Be not hasty in thy spirit to be angry, for anger resteth in the bosom of fools." But I also want to read Ecclesiastes, the 5th chapter, the first 2 verses, because I think it has something to say about this idea of being rash with our mouth. These 2 particular verses, I realize, are verses that talk about our behavior in the house of God. It begins, it says, "Keep thy foot when thou goest to the house of God, and be ready to hear than to give the sacrifice of fools. For they consider not that they do evil. Be not rash with thy mouth, and let not thine heart be hasty to utter anything before God, for God is in heaven and thou upon earth. Therefore let thy words be few." And I got to thinking, it is true about my behavior in the house of God. I was brought up from a very young age to be reverent, to be quiet in church. My ears are bigger than they should be because my mother made sure of that. I have less hair because she worked on that too. But, so that being reverent is not something that comes, hard, is something that's hard for me. But yet, the warning that God gives you and I is appropriate. And I got to thinking, but it's not just in the house of God, is it? The whole earth belongs to God. God sees you and I in our everyday lives. And you and I ought to be sure that we watch the way we live, the footsteps that we take, the things that we say and do. And I got to thinking, how appropriate is these verses to the topic that I'm talking about when it comes to a lack of patience? That we ought to realize that shooting things out of our mouth without very much thought is not a very good characteristic for you and I to be espousing or showing off in our lives that we live. I don't know how many of you know Jephthah. In Judges, the 11th chapter, this is a story about Jephthah. God selected Jephthah to be captain, to go out and to destroy or to fight against the Ammonites. And I don't know whether Jephthah's, being proud had a lot to do with this, but nonetheless, he said to God, I tell you what, if you'll go with me out there and allow me to destroy the Ammonites, the first thing that comes running out of my house when I go home, I'll offer to you in a burnt sacrifice. Now, Jephthah throws caution to the wind. And in the book of Judges, the 11th chapter, the story goes on, Jephthah defeats the Ammonites. And he goes home, and when he's reaching the front part of his property or where he lives, the first thing that greets him is his daughter. But now he's vowed a vow to God. You help me destroy the Ammonites, and I'll offer a burnt offering. The first thing that comes to greet me. Man, do you think, you ever heard that statement, boy, I wish I could suck those words back into my mouth that I just let go? Boy, I bet you Jephthah had that feeling. In Judges, the 11th chapter, and in the 36th verse, how would you like to have your daughter say to you? And she said unto him, My father, if thou hast opened thy mouth unto the Lord, do to me according to that which has proceeded out of thy mouth. I don't know that I'm big enough to deal with that. And yet many times, without even thinking, things just roll right off my tongue as if it's easy for me to do that. It ought to be very difficult for me to do that. I ought to give a lot of thought to what the effects and the consequences could be. I could even end up doing things that are evil when I'm supposed to be avoiding those kind of things and eschewing those kind of evils. And yet, here's an example of Jephthah doing that very thing. You recall in the book of Luke, the 18th chapter, the story about the young rich ruler, and I'm not going to go read that either. I just want to recount to you. He comes up to the Lord and says, hey, Lord, what do I need to do to be saved? And the Lord lists a bunch of things that he needed to do. And again, perhaps because he's a proud individual, he says, you know what? Man, I've done all those things from my youth. He didn't think about what was going to happen next when God said to him, well, you know what? If you really want to be saved, you go and sell all that you got and give to the poor. And the scriptures recorded that the young man went away and did what God asked him to do? Nope. He went away sorrowful. Now, I don't know whether at some point in time he changed his mind about that idea and went and sold what he had and gave to the poor. But, where the story ends was that he went away sorrowful. Ecclesiastes that we just read said in Ecclesiastes 5 and verse 1 or verse 2 rather says, let thy words be few. And surely with these kind of examples that the Lord gives us, we can understand that a lot of times there are times when the loss, the sorrow, the pain, the embarrassment that we suffer could have been avoided by addressing the rashness with which we speak and which we make decisions and say things to others. Let our words be few. Many of you have heard Clay Robertson say, less said, better said. Kind of a takeoff on these things, and I think that's right. I want you to know that in the days that have gone by since I read these verses, that I've worked in some of these areas, and I got to say to you that I find that when I catch myself wanting to be angry or to be involved with wrath or with things of that nature, when I stop and say nothing, not very long thereafter, I feel very good about that particular characteristic that I've just exhibited. But the problem is, in a few minutes, I may be caught in another situation, and that slips away from me. And now the goodness that I saw and I witnessed and I felt is gone because the lack of patience comes home to roost again. And the rashness of my mouth and words continue to create a difficulty. So, and I'm sure it does for all of us, but I thought about this one aspect, how that it should be something that you and I ought to be very involved with. The last part of this lesson is to inquire wisely. I want to spend just a little bit of time with this, not very much. In Ecclesiastes, the 7th chapter and 10th verse, he said, "Say not thou, what is the cause that the former days were better than these? For thou dost not inquire wisely concerning this." And some of the things that I read about this particular topic was that, a lot of times what you and I will do when we want to make a comparison, what we'll do is we'll go back to our former days and we'll pick out those things that, boy, used to be really a lot of fun and we had and it was good times for us. And we look at today's present and the troubles that we've got, and those are the two things that we compare. As if they're on the same plane, as if we're looking, apple to apple and oranges to oranges, and we're not. But that's all right. We make that statement. Oh, for the good old days. One of the things that you and I need to realize is that problem's been around for a long time. You take, for instance, Israel. As I was developing this lesson, I went back and found these things that, it wasn't very long after they left, the story that Brandon's been telling, that they left Egypt. One of the things that happened was in Exodus, the 16th chapter, and the 3rd verse, the children of Israel said unto them, to Moses and Aaron, "Would to God we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots, and when we did eat bread to the full. For ye have brought us forth into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." And so their first hope for the good old days was, man, we weren't hungry then. And so God took care of that for them. Excuse me now. Didn't mean to do that one. Turn to Exodus, the 17th chapter. One chapter later, they're back at it again. In Exodus, the 17th chapter, in the 3rd verse again, "And the people thirsted there for water. And the people murmured against Moses and said, Wherefore is this that thou hast brought us up out of Egypt, to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst?" And then when they got the report about the land that God was going to take them to, the land that flowed with milk and honey, they realized that, the results of the fruits that they brought back, that it was a land that was, very fruitful and that flowed with just like with milk and honey, like I said. But boy, when they found out there was giants, they said, "Man, what have you done? You brought us out here to kill all of us fighting these people." Didn't take them very long to think about the good old days. Man, we ought to be back in Egypt. We don't have to fight these kind of things. So Israel was continuously in that mode and continued day after day for long periods of time with God, doing that very thing of inquiring and saying to God, "Man, it'd been better if we'd stayed in Egypt." As a matter of fact, the story that Brandon accounts is that God took them the way that he did, because if he took them the short way, they would have beaten the trail down to get back to Egypt as fast as they could. And so God took them another way. In Exodus, before I move on to the next thing here, in Exodus, the 2nd chapter, the 23rd verse, just to remind you, it said, "And it came to pass in the process of time that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed by reason of bondage, and cried up to God by reason of the bondage." Didn't take them long to forget about, their difficult times that they were involved in. Instead, they looked at the difficult times that they were involved with today. They looked at when they had food or when they had water, and those are the two things that they compare. Never mind, they don't align, but, what's that got to do with anything? And the same kind of analysis that you and I do today. Job. Someone says, you've heard about the patience of Job, right? In Job, the 29th chapter, 2nd and 3rd verse, Job made a statement. He said, "Oh, that I were in the months past, as in the days when God preserved me, when his candle shined upon my head, and when his light I walked through darkness. He said, well, there's Job doing the same kind of thing. Oh, for my pastimes. Not really. Because, I keep hitting this wrong button. Because in Job, the 2nd chapter and the 10th verse, we find out at the very end of that verse, in all this did not Job sin with his lips. You see, the writer of Ecclesiastes, when he talks about inquire wisely, he says, hey, you're not wise to try to ask, what is the cause of why things are better in the past than they are today? Job never asked of God, why'd you do this? Job simply said that, boy, when God was with me and treated me the way he did, my life was good. And today's different. But he didn't charge God foolishly. He didn't do that with a rash mouth or with statements that indicted God and said, look what you've done to me. Not at all. As a matter of fact, in Job, the 42nd chapter, and in the 12th verse, it goes on to say, so the Lord blessed the latter end of Job more than his beginning. It's kind of interesting to bring this story to a full close as we bring this lesson to a close, that better is the end of a thing than the beginning. And God proves that to you and me. Listen, there are a lot of days when we do things that are difficult and we're not proud about them. It hurts us. But I thought about as I bring this lesson to a conclusion, I thought about my younger days versus where I'm at now. I think about it, that I was a lot more. I'm going to use words that may not be true, but we'll let it fly. I was more agile. I was more versatile. I had no ability to recover. I could go to sleep, after 2 or 3 hours, wake up and get up and motivate, If you know me today, that's not my plan. That's not what I do today. It takes a long time for me to recover. But in all of this, so I speak about the physical side of my life. But when I look at the spiritual side of life, and I realize where I was and where I am today, I don't want to trade. Because the end truly is a better place for me than when I first began. And that I owe to God. Because, see, God has the ability to grab me out of these ditches and holes that I dig and bring me to a state to where now my mind's thinking about, as Brent pointed out, heaven. My direction is in a different way. I may not be the most, I know I'm not. I'm not perfect by a stretch of the imaginations. But at the same time, we need to realize that making little progress on day-to-day of areas that we're lacking in and that we need to improve in is the right thing that God wants out of you and me. This lack of patience, we need to remove that characteristic from our portfolio. We need to be people that exhibit the ability to make good decisions, to listen to the events and to judge things and decide whether they're good or not and to move on. I was on a soccer field just a day or so ago, and it had a bunch of clumps of grass, and we were walking through it, and I was, as I walk, I found it very hard for me to, not think about walking without falling down. I thought, man, I could break an ankle, I could break a bone. When I was young, I'd run through there, and it didn't bother me at all. Didn't even notice it. And life today is that way with us. There are a lot of things that await us to deal with it, but we have got the ability, when we consider the advice and the counsel that God gives us, to do things in a way that's much better for you and I, that helps us. Perhaps you're here today and you haven't been obedient to God by believing and confessing that Jesus is His Son, by repenting of the things that you've done wrong, being baptized for the forgiveness of your sins, to be filled, as the song that we sang, with hope of a better place that lies ahead in the future. Not to think about the good old days, but to think of what lies ahead. You know, Ronald Reagan said, Colin, that our best days are still ahead of us, I think he said. And how true is that? That God has made sure that our better days, or what's better for you and I, still lies ahead. And with hope, we can live and look forward to that day when that can become a reality for you and me. I hope we'll think about these things. If you haven't been obedient to the gospel of Christ, you have that opportunity this morning to be obedient and to be baptized for the forgiveness of sins and to walk in newness of life. Or if you've got difficulties and you need the prayers of the church, we stand ready to help you with that as well, and God will intervene and help you with these kind of areas. But we need to work on these things and make sure that our characteristics are things that prepare us for that great and final day that's approaching every one of us. And so the lesson is yours. If you need to be baptized or need the prayers of the church, won't you come while we stand and sing the song that's been selected?